Do you ever have one of those days where you finally decide, I'm going to say no this time, and then, boom, the guilt rolls in like a thunderstorm? We live in a world that hands out gold stars for burnout, where saying yes to everything means you're a team player, a good friend, a selfless parent, and heaven forbid you carve out time for yourself. Suddenly, you're being called selfish, or worse, you start believing it. But here's the truth. Living for yourself isn't selfish. It's essential, and it's often the most courageous, misunderstood, and emotionally exhausting thing you'll ever choose to do. Not because you're choosing you over others, but because you're finally choosing you with others in mind. Honestly, wholly, and with boundaries that protect your energy, not your ego. What I've seen in over 2 decades of research, hundreds of interviews, and my own messy, imperfect life is this. People who live for themselves in healthy ways are the most emotionally available, generous, and grounded people in the room. And people pleasers, they're often hiding resentment, exhaustion, and fear behind all that yesing. So let's unlearn what the world taught us about selfishness and rewrite the story around living for yourself. We think setting a boundary means slamming a door, but boundaries, real ones, are the opposite. They say, this is where I end and you begin, and that clarity makes room for kindness. The truth is, most of us were never taught how to set a boundary without guilt or without worrying we'd seem cold, distant, or God forbid, too much. So we either build walls or we abandon ourselves completely, and neither one feels good. One keeps people out entirely. The other leaves us wide open, overexposed, and usually exhausted. When I first started learning about boundaries, I had to relearn almost everything I believed about what it meant to be a good person. I believed that love meant sacrifice, that being liked meant always saying yes, that if someone needed me, I was supposed to show up, even if it meant abandoning myself in the process. But what I found in the research, and honestly in my own life, is that people who are the most compassionate and giving are the ones with the strongest boundaries. Here's why. When you give from a place of resentment, it's not generosity. It's quiet self-betrayal. And self-betrayal always comes with a cost. Maybe you snap at your partner later for something small. Maybe you numb out with food or wine or Netflix. Maybe you walk around smiling, but you're simmering underneath. That simmer, it's not sustainable. It builds into burnout, into bitterness, into disconnection. But when you start setting boundaries, something shifts. At first, it feels hard. I won't sugarcoat that. It feels awkward and unfamiliar because it is. You're unlearning years of people-pleasing and over-functioning. You're learning to pause and ask yourself, do I really want to do this? Or is this a yes from the heart or a yes from fear? One of the most life-changing things I've learned is that boundaries are an act of clarity, not cruelty. They're how we teach people what's okay and what's not okay with us. And when we do that with consistency and compassion, we actually build trust. Not just with others, but with ourselves, because when we set a boundary and honor it, we're telling ourselves, you matter. I remember hearing someone say, boundaries don't push people away. They keep the right people close. That hit me in the gut. The people who respect your boundaries, those are your people. And the ones who make you feel guilty for having needs or limits, those aren't your people, or at least not your people for this season. And listen, you don't have to announce your boundaries with a megaphone. Sometimes it's a quiet no. Sometimes it's a simple, I'm not available tonight. Or I'd love to support you, but I don't have the capacity right now. That's enough. You're allowed to be clear without being harsh. So the next time you feel like you're being selfish for setting a boundary, I want you to remember this. Kindness and honesty are not opposites. In fact, The most honest people I know are the kindest because their love comes without strings or silent resentment. Boundaries aren't the end of connection. They're where real connection begins. Living for yourself doesn't have to mean quitting your job, flying to Bali, or posting about living your best life. Sometimes it looks like saying no to a dinner you don't want to go to or not picking up a call when you're depleted. We build self-respect in the tiny choices. Over time, those choices create a life. One of the biggest myths we've internalized is that living for ourselves has to be dramatic. Like we're supposed to wake up one day, write a resignation letter, book a one-way ticket, and reinvent ourselves in the middle of some tropical jungle with Wi-Fi. But for most of us, that's not real life. That's a highlight reel fantasy. And honestly, it puts pressure on us to turn healing into performance. The truth, self-respect is quieter than that. It's a practice, slow, steady, unsexy, and deeply powerful. I've found that the people who truly live for themselves, who live aligned with their values, and who know how to stay rooted in their own worth are not doing it in these big cinematic ways. They're doing it by honoring small choices over and over again. It's things like choosing sleep over obligation, or saying that joke actually hurt when someone crosses a line, or deciding to not check emails on a Sunday because your peace is sacred. And let me say this clearly, it's not easy. These choices, while small, often come with discomfort. Why? Because so many of us have been taught to outsource our worth. We look for approval in the eyes of other people. We take pride in being agreeable, being liked, being useful. But when your sense of value is tied to how convenient or pleasing you are to others, self-respect feels rebellious. But that rebellion, that's where the shift happens. It's subtle. You start choosing yourself in places you used to disappear. You notice when you're faking a yes. You catch yourself before you automatically say, it's fine. And then you pause, you check in, you ask, what do I really need right now? And even if it's just once out of 10 times that you honor that need, that's a beginning. Over time, something beautiful happens. You begin to trust yourself. You start feeling less like a passenger in your own life and more like a participant. Your choices feel less reactive and more intentional. Not perfect, just intentional. That's the thing about self-respect. It doesn't demand perfection. It asks for presence. One of the most powerful signs of self-respect I've seen, both in research and in real life, is people who are willing to disappoint others rather than abandon themselves. That's tough. That's countercultural, but that is where you begin to anchor into your own enoughness. Because when you start living from a place of grounded self-worth, you realize you don't owe anyone your constant availability. You don't have to be everything to everyone. You are allowed to take up space in your own life. And those tiny moments, those almost invisible pivots toward truth, rest, honesty, boundaries, they accumulate, they stack, they build the life you want, not in one big leap, but in 1,000 small acts of self-honor. Because at the end of the day, self-respect isn't something you demand. It's something you demonstrate quietly, consistently, even when no one's watching, especially then. Here's the kicker. You will feel guilt when you start putting yourself first. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something new. Guilt is often a sign you're pushing against internalized rules you didn't write. Keep going. Question the rule, not your worth. One of the most difficult emotions to sit with when you start choosing yourself is guilt. That heavy, twisting in your stomach feeling that whispers, who do you think you are? For a long time, I thought guilt was the voice of my conscience, that it was some sacred emotional compass meant to guide me toward what's right. But over time, and through a lot of research and even more lived experience, I've learned something important. Guilt isn't always truth. Sometimes it's just programming. Guilt shows up when we go against the rules we've internalized, and those rules aren't always healthy. Many of them were handed to us before we had the chance to question them. Be nice, be agreeable, don't upset anyone, always help, don't be selfish. So when you decide to say no or take a step back or choose your mental health over someone else's expectations, guilt pipes up, not because you've done something bad, but because you've stepped outside the script. And this is where a lot of people give up, not because they lack courage, but because they confuse guilt with wrongdoing, but they're not the same. Think of guilt like the sound your smoke alarm makes when you burn toast. It's loud, it's stressful, but it's not always signaling a fire alarm fire. It's a reaction, not a fact. What helps is to pause and ask, is this guilt based on a real value of mine or a fear of judgment? That question has saved me more times than I can count. Because guilt tied to values, that's important. That's your inner compass. But guilt tied to people-pleasing, perfectionism, or old social conditioning, that's emotional static. You don't need to follow that. When we start to build new boundaries or prioritize rest or speak up for ourselves, guilt is often the first emotion to arrive, not because you're failing, but because you're finally changing the rules. And rules, especially those unspoken ones about being nice or selfless, don't like being rewritten. But that doesn't mean you stop. It means you move forward with the discomfort. The clients, students, and folks I've worked with who have done the most meaningful healing work aren't the ones who avoid guilt. They're the ones who've learned how to walk through it. They've learned to recognize when guilt is just the echo of an old identity that's no longer serving them. And more importantly, they've learned to respond with self-compassion rather than self-punishment. Here's something else I've noticed. When you stick with it, when you choose yourself again and again, guilt starts to quiet down. Not because you've become cold or indifferent, but because your nervous system learns that you are safe being seen even when someone else doesn't approve. That's emotional resilience. That's how you shift from living in reaction to living in alignment. So the next time guilt comes up, when you draw a line or protect your peace, don't let it stop you. Get curious. Ask it questions. Don't obey it just because it's loud. Sometimes the loudest voices in our head are just old stories trying to keep us small. You don't have to feel good to do what's right for you. Sometimes doing what's right for you is what eventually helps you feel good. Being self-centered says, only I matter. Being self-connected says, I matter too. There's a big difference. When we connect with ourselves, we show up more fully for others. You cannot pour from an empty cup. And you don't get bonus points for trying. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics I've come across, not just in research, but in real conversations with people who are desperately trying to hold it all together while quietly losing themselves. Somewhere along the way, we blurred the line between being connected to ourselves and being selfish. We were told, you're thinking too much about yourself, when what we were really doing was trying to honor our feelings, our energy, our boundaries. But let's be really clear. Being connected to yourself doesn't mean you don't care about others. It means you're finally including yourself in the care. Think about that for a second. How often have you been there for someone else, showed up, made the dinner, took the call, listened to the problem, when deep down you were running on fumes? We don't call it out because we've normalized it. We praise it even. We call it being a good friend, being selfless, being strong. But what's the cost? Here's what I've seen over and over again. People who are constantly giving without reconnecting to themselves eventually burn out, not just emotionally, but relationally. Their giving becomes mechanical. Their empathy starts to erode, resentment builds, and connection, the very thing they were trying to protect, begins to break down. And here's the paradox. People who are deeply self-connected actually have more to give, not less. Why? Because they're grounded. Because they're in touch with their needs, their limits, and their truth. That kind of presence, authentic presence, is what creates real intimacy. Not performative yeses, not silent sacrifice, just honest, embodied, wholehearted presence. I remember speaking with someone who said, I feel selfish if I take time for myself. I asked her what she meant. She said, there are so many people who need me. And I said, and how long can you give to all those people before you have nothing left? She just got really quiet and nodded. That's the thing. We know, deep down, we know when we're running on empty, but we keep pushing because the fear of being labeled self-centered is bigger than our desire to connect with ourselves. Let's unlearn that. Let's normalize saying, I need time to think, or I can't take that on right now, or even just I matter too. That's not ego. That's emotional maturity. That's what self-connection sounds like. It's about noticing when you're dysregulated, when you're shrinking to keep the peace, or when you're pretending to be fine, and then choosing to pause, to check in, and to listen. That's not selfish. That's the foundation of showing up whole. Because when we're disconnected from ourselves, we can't be fully connected to anyone else. We're half present, half aware, trying to manage everyone's feelings while ignoring our own. But when we're self-connected, we create space for real empathy. Empathy that doesn't cost us our sanity. So the next time that voice in your head tells you that choosing yourself means you're self-centered, I want you to stop and ask, am I being selfish, or am I finally being honest about what I need? There's a world of difference. And the people who truly love you, who want the best for you, not just from you, they'll feel the difference too. Choosing to live for yourself won't always make sense to others. Some people will misunderstand you, question you, maybe even distance themselves. It's not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's often a sign you're finally being real. One of the most tender and difficult truths we have to face when we start showing up authentically is this: not everyone will celebrate it. In fact, some people will resist it, not because they're bad or unkind, but because your truth might unsettle theirs. And that discomfort, it can show up as silence, pushback, gossip, or the slow fade of connection. It hurts. Let's not pretend it doesn't, especially when you've spent your life being the peacemaker, the helper, the reliable one, the person who keeps everyone else comfortable. When you begin to live in a way that honors your inner voice, rather than the version of you that kept things running smoothly for others, it creates a shift. And sometimes that shift makes waves. But here's what I've come to believe deeply. Being misunderstood is not a failure. It's often a byproduct of growth. When you stop over-explaining, when you stop twisting yourself into something more palatable, when you stop choosing peace at your own expense, yes, some people will be confused. They'll say, you've changed, and they're right, you have. You've stopped abandoning yourself. And that, my friend, is sacred work. And we don't like to talk about this part. We like to think that when we finally embrace our truth and start living for ourselves, everything falls into place. Cue the applause, cue the harmony. But the reality is often more complicated. There's grief in growth. There's grief in realizing that some connections were rooted in a version of you that no longer exists. But here's what I want to offer you. It's okay. It's okay to feel sad even when you know you're doing the right thing. It's okay to mourn the loss of approval while still standing by your truth. It's okay to be misunderstood. Because clarity within yourself is more sustaining than external validation. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be aligned with yourself. And alignment isn't loud. It doesn't need to convince or defend. It just quietly grounds you over and over again in who you really are. That's how you know you're on the right path, not because everyone claps, but because you can finally breathe. So if you're in that messy middle right now, if you're feeling the ache of distance from people who once felt close, if you're wondering if living for yourself is worth it because it feels lonelier than you expected, I want you to remember something. You're not losing people, you're finding yourself. And the people who are meant for the real you, the you who is present, whole, and no longer performing, they won't need to be convinced. They'll recognize you. They'll meet you there. They'll love you not for what you give, but for who you are. That kind of connection is worth the courage it takes to let go of the rest. Keep going. So here's the truth. Living for yourself without feeling selfish isn't about becoming someone else. It's about finally becoming you, without apology, without overexplaining, without shrinking to fit a story that was never yours to begin with. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's daily. It's quiet. It's choosing boundaries over burnout. It's building self-respect in small, sacred ways. It's recognizing guilt, not as a red light, but as a signal that you're writing a new narrative. It's replacing the fear of being self-centered with the freedom of being self-connected. And yes, it's hard. It will stretch you. It will ask you to sit in discomfort and to let go of roles that once felt safe. But it will also bring you home to yourself, to your values, to your truth, to a life that feels aligned, not with who others expect you to be, but with who you actually are. You are allowed to live a life that feels good on the inside, even if it challenges the expectations on the outside. You are allowed to be whole, not just helpful, seen, not just needed, loved, not just useful. So go gently, go bravely, and most of all, go as you. Good luck. You've got this.